plenary program, we are very much fortunate to have a very distinguished keynote speaker. Josep Maria Cots is a professor of English and Applied Linguistics at the University of Lleida, where he teaches courses in pragmatics, discourse analysis, intercultural communication, multilingual education, and English. His research focuses on applied discourse analysis, foreign language teaching and learning, multilingualism, and intercultural competence. He adopts a qualitative approach, a social-linguistic and ethnographic and discourse analysis, to study the development of multilingual and intercultural competence in the context of specific language policies in secondary and tertiary education. He has published 8 books and numerous journal articles and book chapters. Today he's here to talk about promoting translingual and transcultural competence at university. I'm very happy on a personal level to have him here with us, because we have a very special contact, as both of us are in CultNet group, a group of researchers directed by Professor Michael Byron. So having him here is a great pleasure. So I give the floor to him, and let's listen to what he has to say. Thank you.
Yes, buenos dias. Good morning, everybody. I would like to thank, first of all, the members of the TC4PI team and especially Paloma, for having thought of me to give a talk here at this conference. It's always a pleasure to meet with Paloma, but it's also a pleasure for me to be able to learn from people who've been on the site and working very much on the kind of things that I tend to teach my students that they should do when they go to when they find a job working in secondary school. I also wanted to say that it's not easy, it's never easy to talk to an audience of people that you don't know very well, because they might know practically and theoretically, they might know more things than you have to say, and especially in this kind of audience where there are people who've been thinking about plurilingualism for the last 3 years of their lives and reading about it. I was a bit hesitant about what I was going to say, because I thought, well, maybe for them they'll say, we know that already. Okay, fortunately then Paloma said that there'll be some students as well. Okay, so the students don't know very much. All right, so I'll be able to say something new for them. Okay, so anyway, so in the end I thought, well, what can I say to them that maybe they haven't heard? Well, I'll tell them about my experience. I'll tell them about what I do, what I make my living with, okay, which is training future secondary school teachers of English. And I'll tell them about, the way I try to introduce plurilingualism and intercultural competence in an English studies degree, okay, which is not always the case, Very often in our English philology or in our philology departments, we tend to follow what I like to call a monolingual ideology. Everything has to be in English, or everything has to be in French, everything has to be in German, okay? So I'm a little bit the black sheep in my department, because I like mixing languages. I like polluting, the pure nature of the language. So anyway, so I'll try to tell you what I do. I'll try to tell you. So here is the outline of my talk. I want to tell you a little bit of my thinking about what it means to me training EFL teachers at university, right? The way training is organized, which for some of you is already known, but maybe for some others is not so well known. Then I'll share with you some key notions that have inspired me in the way I teach, in the way I do my job in teaching both language and applied linguistics, right? And then I'll give you two examples from two different subjects that I teach, in which I hope you'll be able to see the impact of plurilingualism and interculturality in my teaching. So there'll be subject A and subject B. Right. This is, as I said, known to many of you, but this is my situation. I work between a 4-year degree in English Studies and a Master's of Arts in Secondary Education Teacher Training. A Master Oficial de Formación de Profesorado Secundaria, for those of you who are familiar with the Spanish system, all right? So the examples that I'm going to give you, they all come from the 4-year degree in English Studies, right? Now, the core part, for those of you who are not familiar, the core part of the degree in English Studies, at least in my university, which is about 75% of the total number of credits of 300 ECTSs, right? This is a breakdown of the different areas, right? There's 27.5% of English language, then there's another 27.5% of descriptive and applied linguistics, and here I've broken this down into general, descriptive and applied linguistics, and specifically focusing on English, 11%. Then there is literature, again also divided between general and English. Then there's a part of English history and culture, and finally there's a general block on arts and humanities. Okay, so this is the kind of input, 75% of the input. The rest is optional courses that the students can take. So this already gives you an idea of the kind of input that a graduate in English studies will get at the end of his or her 4th year, right? As you can see, the only bit of didactics or applied linguistics, it comes into the second block, which is descriptive and applied linguistics, which is about 1/4, 25% of the total input that they receive. Okay? And then those graduate students who are interested in moving into in having working as teachers, then they can follow an MA in secondary education teacher training. And here the subjects are divided into 3 main blocks. There's a general didactics block, which is worth 25% of the total number of credits. There's a very significant block, TEFL training, 42%, and then the practicum, which is about 1/3, right? So this is the input that my future English as a foreign language teachers are going to get throughout their studies. Right. Let me start with a bit of reflection about that I have made in terms of how I should conduct my job. All right. I would like you to read these quotations, which come from this book edited by Nat Bartels, and actually this is the article that Nat Bartels himself wrote in this edited volume. Okay? He says, first of all, it is claimed that teachers will be able to transfer this knowledge of theories and research findings generated by linguists and applied linguistics to the activities and context of L2 teaching. Right? The problem with this argument is that the concept of knowledge transfer has been used more as a justification for the activity of educators and teacher educators like myself and like Paloma, rather than an empirical concept to be empirically investigated. So we tend to rely a lot, those of us who are in teacher training, we tend to rely a lot on, how easily you will be able to transfer the knowledge that we infuse on you onto the actual school, the actual teaching in your primary and secondary school classes. So we tell you, we give you knowledge, we convey knowledge to you, and that knowledge, for some art of magic, you'll be able to transform it and make of yourselves excellent teachers. All right? And that, Bartels says, well, it is still to be empirically proved, empirically well described, how this transfer of knowledge from theoretical knowledge becomes practical, pragmatic knowledge. And then another idea of Bartels is you have it in the second quotation, research on knowledge transfer has shown that for knowledge to transfer successfully, the practice tasks, that is to say, what is done in the university setting have to be as similar as possible to the target tasks. That is to say, what the L2 teachers, in our case English teachers, do in schools at both the surface level and at a deeper level. Right? In other words, if I want to train my students to do collaborative work, I have to do collaborative work in my classes. If I want them to rely on using plurilingualism, I have to teach my classes at university using plurilingualism, incorporating fully plurilingualism in my classes. It is not enough to tell my students about all the benefits of plurilingualism if I teach my class only through the medium of English. Right? I need to show them through examples that plurilingualism is possible, for instance. Okay? All right. So, what are the key notions that have had the greatest impact on my job as a teacher trainer? Well, there are four main key notions that I follow in designing my classes, in designing my courses. Okay? The first notion is the one that you have in the title of my talk, translingual and transcultural competence. Right? The second one is language culture. The third one, translanguaging, and the fourth one, English as an international language. Right? Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about it, not necessarily the whole theoretical background about it. Okay, the notion of translingual and transcultural competence, I borrow it from a document that the Modern Language Association prepared through the course of 3 years, from 2004 to 2007. It was a committee that was specifically created to express a vision of the association in terms of what modern language departments, university departments in North America, what would be the goal, what should be the goal of modern language departments in North America in the 21st century, right? And they came up with this idea of translingual and transcultural competence, all right? Which, as you can see, all right, has, I would say, 5 main components. The first one is that who is somebody who has translingual and transcultural competence? Well, they say it's not necessarily a native speaker, all right? It is not a replica of a native speaker. It is simply someone who can function as an informed and capable interlocutor with educated speakers of the target language, whatever target or target languages. Okay? You don't necessarily have to learn just one language, but you may want to learn more than one language. Okay? And they reinforce this with the third premise, which is that someone who is translingual and transcultural competent is someone who is able to operate between languages/cultures. Okay? And you'll see why I put languages/cultures, because I have a bit of a mess with that. Okay? What is a language? What is a culture? Okay. Thirdly, it is someone who understands otherness. All right? It is someone who comprehends speakers of the target language as members of a different society, and it is also someone who can understand oneself as a member of a society that is foreign to others, to other people. Right? And finally, it is someone who can reflect on the world and oneself through the lens of another language and culture. Right? So that is a concept that I try to bear in mind whenever I'm in front of my students. The second concept that I use as a guideline for my classes is the concept of language culture, right? Which is a concept that was proposed by Rieseger. Before it had been proposed, Karen Rieseger is someone who Paloma and I have the pleasure of meeting. Is one of those wise people in the world, right? Okay, and it was proposed by somebody else, by an anthropologist, and it has to do a little bit with what I was telling you about, the reason why I put language/culture, because I think that it's not always easy to differentiate between what is a language and what is a culture, right? The structuralist tradition that we come from, starting with Saussure, has in a way made us think of languages as independent systems from the way they are used. All right? So we look at languages as almost kind of mathematical systems of rules, all right, that we can easily describe as detached from the way they are used. Okay? Well, from my point of view, this is not quite the idea of the language culture concept. The language culture concept is, the idea is that it is not possible to teach language outside of the way it is used. And that's why I like this definition of language culture that Risager and others make, which is defining language culture as sets of communicative practices, right? Different communicative practices that conform the everyday lives of people, right? These communicative practices are socially constituted and socially learned, right? You can try and learn them in the classroom. You say, well, I learn English in the classroom. But if you learn English, maybe you're not learning the socially constituted communicative practices, right? And that's why we have to resort to the idea of, well, finally, you actually learn English when you go to the country where it is spoken. Why? Because then you become a participant in those communicative practices. Right? Now, language culture includes both verbal but also non-verbal communicative systems. Right? The way you dress, the way you move your hands, the way you move your eyes, the way you smile. Right? And finally, language culture, right, looks at language as situated in specific social and cultural contexts. There can be a full description of language if we don't take into account that every time we look at language, every time language has a purpose, is used, it is situated in a specific social and cultural context. All right. So, I like this idea of language culture, and I try to introduce it in my classes as much as I can. So how do I do that? How do I deal with language culture in class? Well, I borrow this kind of framework from someone called Crozet, right? Who is quoted in a book by Raquel Diaz, all right? Now, just to give you an idea, let's imagine we have two language cultures, okay? A language culture X and a language culture Y. You want to call it, let's say language culture X, it would be Spanish, the way it's spoken in Valladolid, in Castilla, right? Language culture Y could be English, the way it's spoken in, Germany, all right? Just not to mention a country where English is spoken, all right? Now, you can look at these, so you can look at these language cultures in terms of 5 parameters, right? You can look at the two language cultures, first of all, in terms of level of verbosity, all right? The importance placed on speaking in the function of society, in the way society, in some societies, speaking is very important, but maybe in other societies, in other language cultures, maybe speaking or speaking loud, for instance, maybe it's not so important. So that's already a way of differentiating that. Then approaches to interpersonal relationships, right? The way different societies conceive and express personal relationships. For example, you may value proximity. One society may value proximity, informality. Another society may value totally the opposite. Formality and distance, right? Approaches to politeness. There are different ways of being polite. We know that. Sometimes being polite is being very informal. In other cases, being polite is being extremely formal, all right? Right. Then, level of ritualization. This has to do with the degree of strictness or freedom in verbal behavior, all right? Sometimes, when we have in our classes, I have sometimes in our classes students from Korea or Japan, and they tend to be very formal. Or even students from Germany, they call me doctor. And my students, they look at them and say, what, doctor? Just call him by his first name, And they say, no, I can't do that, all right? It would be totally unthinkable in Germany to address to a professor and not addressing them as doctor or professor. So I have to know whether he's just a doctor or he's a professor. I can't just say John or Peter. You know, that's totally... So that would have to do with levels of ritualization. And finally, levels of expressivity, which has to do with the relevance of emotions, for instance, or the level of inner feelings. Right? Now, why is this useful to me? Well, because I can make language cultures, I can make two language cultures of one language. All right? So I could look at the English spoken in Britain, and I could look at the English spoken in the States. And I tell my students, these are two language cultures. All right? Not only because they have different vocabulary, different grammar rules, if you force me, but also because they react differently to all these parameters. All right? That's a way for me to tell my students that you can't just say, I studied English. You study English language culture, all right, which is more based in one culture or another. Or perhaps it's a mixture, all right? Sometimes it's a mixture. Most likely, because they watch films in British English, they'll watch films in American English, sometimes in New Zealand English, and so they get different cultures. Okay, I want to tell you next about the third notion that I use, which is that of translanguaging. But first of all, I need you to think about this. I need you to think and make a decision between the red options that you have. Teaching should or should not be carried out exclusively in the foreign language without recourse to the student's L1, teaching a foreign language, right? Well, what do you think? What are your beliefs about that? Translation between the L1 and the foreign language has or has no place in the teaching of a foreign language. And languages, L1, L2, foreign languages, must or need not be taught separately in the school context. Now, that is important, right? I'm not going to ask you what your answer is, but the idea is it better keeping languages isolated, okay? Or is it better to mix them as much as you can, all right? What results in more efficient learning, right? Okay? The tendency, I am afraid, and this is not the place to say that, but in many schools the tendency is to isolate languages, to follow monolingual approaches. So you've got your Spanish class, and you've got your English class, and then you've got other classes, your Latin class, your Catalan class, your Basque class, all right? So they're very much separated, and it's difficult for teachers to meet and design integrated curricula. Fortunately, I think that the members of the team here are making a great effort to convince teachers, right, that this is not always the case. So, as you can imagine, and from what I'll be telling you next, my option is always in favor of dancing together. All right, I think it's nicer, if you can get two people to get in sync and make something, the two of them. All right, so. My next concept is the concept of translanguaging, right? The one that I tend to use. Look at how this person called Kanagaraja defines translanguaging. The ability of multilingual speakers to shuttle. Notice that he uses shuttle, not even switching. He says shuttle between languages, treating the diverse languages that form their repertoire as an integrated system. Right? So we're talking about translanguaging. And we could be easily talking about plurilingual people, okay? It's, we're referring to similar things. We're talking about someone having a repertoire, a bilingual, trilingual, plurilingual repertoire, and being able to shuttle between these languages, all right, for different purposes, right? Now, why should we get into such a mess of languages when we have them so well organized in schools? We have the Department of English, the Department of Spanish, the Department of German, okay? Why should we get into that, okay? Well, there are people like Alistair Cummings who've said that actually there is a very high level of independence between skills and knowledge across languages. That is to say, if you're a good writer in Spanish, you are very likely to be a good writer in English, right? If you're a very extroverted person in Spanish, you're very likely to be a very extroverted person in English. If you can participate in a very fluent way in Spanish, you're very likely to do that. Right? The skills that you need to make a text, to participate in situation in communicative practices, tend to be interdependent. Right? Okay. And so sometimes maybe we're doubling or tripling up the job because we're telling one thing, we're teaching our students to make a narrative text in Spanish, and then we are teaching the same thing in English to make another narrative text in English. When we could work together, if the Spanish and the English teachers work together, they could teach both at the same time and maybe plurilingually what it is like to build up a narrative text. Argumentative text, description, etc. All right. The second reason, and here there's a lot of people who can say about that, is fostering plurilingualism. Translanguaging, asking my students to shuttle between languages, is a way of fostering plurilingualism. And in that sense, I'm following the philosophy of the Common European Framework, I'm following the philosophy of the Council of Europe, and I think I'm doing a service to a Europe and a world that is more united, that can understand each other much better. All right? I'm sure that the definition of plurilingualism will come out here, but basically what I want to say is, what does it mean then, translanguaging? And I have listed a few things. All right? Well, it's basically translanguaging is using your complete language repertoire in order to do things like the following: make yourself understood, convey a certain nuance of meaning that you cannot express in the language that you are using at that moment, make sure that you have understood the others, contrast and compare different language phenomena, mix all your languages freely according to the situation and your current needs, right? Showing some sort of cultural hybridity, right? And sometimes even inventing new ways of communicating, okay? Inventing new words, right? Okay, and my last concept is English as an international language. Other people have called these, have referred to these as English as a lingua franca, English as a means of international communication, etc. Okay? Now, my reflections here are the reflections of the people who've written about English as an international language. My first reflection is that I try to convey my students about, or at least I ask them to question, who owns English? Right? Who's the boss in the English language? Is it the people living in Britain? Is it the people living in the United States? Is it the people living in South Africa? Or the people living in India? And my students said, no, in India, no. No. They speak with an accent. Tell them, what about the Americans? Or what about the British? They speak, oh, but it's the accent. Ah, okay, thank you, all right? And then I tell them a bit more, because this is just people who speak English as an L1 or an L2. But then I say, what about myself? Do I own English? Or what about you? Oh, we are non-native speakers. Oh no, we'll never be native speakers. How could we possibly own English? How could we possibly face up to a native speaker and say, well, so what? What if I say this in mixing it with a little bit of Spanish? All right? Okay. So the idea, my idea is, well, to try and empower my students. The idea of an eternal, a never-ending deficit in non-native speakers is something that I want to erase from my students' minds. Because this is something that you always live with, all right? This constant complex in, oh, I speak with an accent, okay? I'll never be like a native speaker. Oh, I wish I could speak like Shakespeare, or I wish I could speak like Kenneth Branagh or whoever, all right? So this is something that I try to tell them. The other concept about connected with English as an international language is who is the model, all right? And that's very much connected with who owns English. What model, what target do I give to my students, okay, as something that I would like them to reach? Is it a native speaker, or is it what I like to call a successful bilingual or multilingual speaker? Right? So when I do a listening comprehension in class, if I ever do one, do I give them a listening comprehension recorded by a native speaker, or by a German speaker, or by a Catalan speaker? Right? Do I have any problems with that? Well, I try not to. And I try that my students don't have problems with that. Because if it's a successful multilingual, I think I have a lot more things to say about a successful German multilingual who speaks English, German, and Italian than a monolingual native speaker of English. To me, okay, it is a person that has shown me a lot more flexibility, a lot more language interest, the trilingual person, than the monolingual native speaker. Okay? So that's the model that I would like them to try and imitate. There's another concept related to English as an international language, which is that of intercultural awareness. And I tend to oppose it to the concept of cultural awareness. Why? Why do I do that? Well, because I think that the concept of cultural awareness is still very much rooted in a national conception of language, right? You have Spanish culture. You have English, and then you think of British culture and maybe American culture, right? North American, US culture, right? And I try to get away from that. And especially, it's the same with Spanish. You say Spanish culture, but then what is Spanish culture? Spanish culture of Colombia, Argentina. Oh, no, you'll say, no, Spanish from Spain. Yes, who says that? All right. Okay. What kind of culture do you study with Spanish? And with English, what kind of culture do you study with English? South African culture, right? Where many people are bilingual, Afrikaans or even trilingual, right? The ones who speak Xhosa, the language of Nelson Mandela. So the concept of intercultural awareness, from my point of view, accounts better for this connection between context and communicative practices, right? It's a more flexible context to me. Basically, the intercultural context has to do with the idea of accommodating to the culture that you progressively identify in the other, right? Having this sensitivity, right? To, first of all, accept that, wow, maybe the other person, even though we both speak English, maybe he or she speaks another English language culture. And I need to be alert to that, all right? And I need to accommodate, and he'll probably accommodate to me as well, all right? So this sensitivity, I think it's much better, it's much useful to me. And finally, I tell my students that English as an international language can contribute to facilitating intercultural communication. Whether we want it or not, many people in the world speak English, right? So English is a way for you to get to know their culture. And you will both be speaking English as an international language. Neither of you will be using English as a native language, but through English you will be able to convey your culture to your language culture, if you want, to the other, and the other will be able to convey your culture. And you will be able to start negotiating meanings, right? Which I think is very important. All right, so let's move on to the examples. So my first subject is a subject that I teach in second year, and it's called Describing and Using English, right? Basically, this is a subject dealing with, and Paloma has read about the courses that I teach, it's a course on pragmatics and discourse analysis. The only problem is that if we put pragmatics and discourse analysis, our students, second year students, say, what the hell is this, But if we put describing and using English, then they feel like they understand a little bit more the title, right? But basically, the idea of the course is that we want our students to be able to focus on situated language in use, not invented sentences by myself and describing them syntactically, but situated, real language in use. Okay? We want them to acquire a methodology for describing and explaining that language in use. And finally, and that's why we call it describing and using, because we believe, and this is a premise from which we start, that from raising their awareness about English, that they'll become better users. We believe that the more aware you are about how you use a language or languages, the better user you become. The less aware, the not so good user you become. Okay? And I put down here what I think are the main notions, of the key notions that I mentioned here in this specific subject. The two main notions that I think have had the greatest impact are language culture and translanguaging. And I'll tell you how maybe I wanted to do that because you'll see it clearly. Okay. All right. I just wanted to start with a brief example. You'll say, this is very simple. Well, this is real language in use that you hardly ever, in a course on syntax, you hardly ever see this. First of all, syntax has to do with written language and with sentences juxtaposed or subordinated. Well, here is a brief exchange in an everyday conversation. Say the phone is ringing, then somebody else says, I'm in the bathroom, and the first person says, okay. Right? In principle, this is totally inconsistent. That doesn't have coherence. What does the phone have to do with bathroom? Unless you're a millionaire and you have phones in your bathroom. I mean, what does it have to do, being in the bathroom and the phone ringing? Okay. But I'm sure that all of you said, well, this makes completely sense to me, right? Okay. And it makes sense to you because you're looking at it as a communicative practice. Maybe you yourselves have been in a communicative practice like this, which is someone asking you to do something, you excusing yourself for not being able to do it or not wanting to do it and inventing an excuse, and then the other person accepting your excuse, right? So you put yourself in the communicative situation, and that's why you've been able to make sense of this. So these are the kind of examples. We work with more complex examples, but I just wanted to give you a taste of the kind of what we mean by situated language in this subject. Okay. Now, here comes the translanguaging model that we use here, right? Basically, remember, this is a subject in English, offered by the English department, so it would be a subject, like many other subjects, which in principle would be taught exclusively through the medium of English. We would be looking at English examples, classes would be in English, assignments would be in English, everything would be in English. What happens in this subject? Well, we spend quite a bit of time on working from the students L1, right? We start with the students L1, all right? We look, first of all, at the communicative skills that the students already have in their first language, right? Then we analyze, okay, what is it that they know in order to be able to accomplish such beautiful texts or conversations in their first language. And from that, we derive a series of concepts or meta-linguistic notions, okay, that should allow them to move up to the right-hand side, to the right-hand side, and start analyzing examples in English, and finally communicating in English, right? So basically, what we do, what happened? So maybe the transparency will come up later. Here, then I'll go back. I don't know why. Holy. I don't know what happened. Gosh. Uno, tres. What happened with the rest? Oops. Gosh. This is la animación, has problems, my animación. Anyway, I'll leave it in 3 and then I'll fill up the gaps. Okay. So basically the idea is think, the first step in my class is think and talk about what you know, your L1, right? The second step is see if you can analyze what is it that you know that helps you to say this. What kind of knowledge do you know? Then analyze your foreign language and finally use it. All right? So it's 4 steps, remember. Think and talk about your L1, so they do a lot of pair work from their own examples, from other people's examples. Then analyze it, see what you can say, and then you'll see, I hope you'll be able to see some examples. Then analyze examples of the foreign language, and finally use it. Okay, sorry about this. Okay, gosh, I got it all mixed up. Look at this. And the example was, example was here. Okay, all right. So this is a mixture of steps 1 and steps 2. Think about your first language, okay, and analyze it, all right? Okay, so take a look. This would be a voicemail message. Actually, it could be a WhatsApp message, right? A recorded WhatsApp message these days, right? It says, hola, buenos días, Ángeles. I'll read it as I read to my students. Hola, buenos días, Ángeles o Javier, soy Tony de Viajes de Aventura. Por favor, cuando podáis llamarme porque me han respondido sobre el tema de Florencia, es bastante urgente, gracias y hasta luego. Right? Now, there's something missing here, right? So what do I tell my students? What do you think I tell them? Remember, this is a subject on telling my students, explaining my students about language as action. Okay, using language as action. Looking at language from the point of view of its function in everyday life. The concept in pragmatics is speech acts. Alright? Looking at language as speech acts. Okay? So I give them this, and I really like this, and what do you think I tell them? I say, alright, there's something wrong here. Yes, they say, you need some punctuation marks. Right? And then I tell them, why do I need punctuation marks? Well, because it's not one mess, because there are different things, they say. There are different things going on here. What things are going on here, I tell them? Well, they say, first of all, there is a greeting, right? Hola, buenos días. Maybe you want to put Ángeles or Javier together, but some students say, no, hola, buenos días should be different from Ángeles or Javier because it has a different function, all right? And then they say, soy Tony de Viajes Aventura. This has a different function, right? Okay? So, por favor, cuando podáis llamarme, maybe this has a different function from porque han respondido sobre el tema de Florencia. Right? And they all agree, after Florencia there should be something. Okay, maybe a period, there should be something, because what comes after is different. Es bastante urgente, alright, and then say, here there should also be a separation. Gracias, and then they say, gracias is different from hasta luego, yeah? Because gracias is thanking, hasta luego is leave-taking, correct? Okay? So, they're working on Spanish as their first language, or Catalan as their first language, all right? And I've asked them to think about the way to describe everyday language use, okay? And then I say, what was the basis for your segmentation? You can't say sentences, you can't say words, all right? It's speech acts, okay? It's actions, it's things that you do, it's intentions. What was the intention in saying hola, buenos días, all right? What was the intention in saying gracias, okay, right? Okay, so this would be steps 1 and 2. Look at your first language, think about it, and then try to analyze it. Okay? Okay. All right. So, what kind of, you remember at the bottom of my graphic was the meta-linguistic concepts and notions. Okay, concepts and notions. These are, to make it very simple, the 3 notions that I give them, meta-linguistic notions that I give them, in order to be able to analyze speech acts. The concept of locutionary act, the concept of illocutionary act, and the concept of perlocutionary act. Okay? This is a key set of 3 concepts in order to understand how people communicate with each other. Okay? All right. And so I continue on to step 3, all right, where I give you a situation like this. Here is 2 examples of possible situations. Someone saying the same thing and the other person interpreting something totally different, right? There's a party tomorrow, I'm not sure I want to go. A person says, let me know when you have made up your mind. Okay, I will. But in the other situation, there's a party tomorrow, I'm not sure I want to go. Why do you not want to go? All right. How is it possible, okay, that using the same words, the A speaker understands something totally different, right? Okay. Anyway, this is just to introduce them to the concept of speech acts, okay? And then we get to the 4th step, where I actually ask them to use speech acts, all right, in their foreign language, okay? Here you have 5 speech acts, suggest a minimum of 2 possible realizations for each, and here you have some, the 5 speech acts that I give them. Okay. Here is another activity in step 4, which it means using the foreign language, working with a partner. Try to think of 5 different situations in which you may find yourself while visiting the UK. What kinds of speech acts do you need to be most readily familiar with? And here, pick one of the situations that you identified in the previous activity and try to enact it with your partner. Record the interaction with your mobile phone so that we can play it for the rest of the class. Here is an example of listening comprehension with students poor English or bad English or very heavily accented English, all right? They're working on the language of their classmates, all right? They're not working on very good English. They're working on the English that their partners use. Is this English as an international language? For me, it is, all right? So I try to make as much as possible use of English as an international language. Okay, I'm right. The second subject is a subject that I teach in third year. This is English language. It's about, those of you who are familiar with the Common European Framework, it's about C1 level, right? And it's a subject that is aimed at not only developing but also integrating communicative skills. And here I use two key notions of the four that I listed to you at the beginning of my talk. Language culture and English as an international language. Okay? Now for these, I use a model that has been proposed by these two people, Patricia Ruggiano-Schmidt and Claudia Finbeiner, and this is the book where they propose the model, and there are examples of how to use it, which they define as a model for raising the awareness of future teachers and professionals, about the typo, about intercultural communication, all right? Now, what does the ABC involve? The ABC involves basically 3 stages, okay? The first stage is the cultural autobiography, that's why it's A. Then the second stage is the cultural biography, and the third stage is the cross-cultural analysis, okay? How do I apply this into my English language classes? Well, this is what I do. I tell them that in the first stage, each student must write a cultural autobiography, starting with their earliest memories. And I give them examples of family, religion, education, celebrations, victories. What is a cultural autobiography? It's an autobiography which is written for someone who does not know anything about your own culture, who comes from Mars or from Pluto, if you want, okay? So you can't say, of course, when I was 7, I did my first communion. You can't say that, all right? And then stop, and you don't say anything else, then they'll say, what do you mean your first communion, okay? And with my parents, I was going to church on Sunday. What is church, you know? So a cultural autobiography has to be an autobiography which should be read by someone who shares very few cultural background with you, very little cultural background with you, okay? So you have to make yourself aware of the fact that there's a lot of common sense knowledge that other people don't use it, right? And that's not easy for them to do, okay? Especially because we think of another culture, or I'll write for my friend in France. No. Think of another, that's why I tell them Mars, okay? Because then they can't relate to they don't watch the same television in Mars, they don't read the same papers, they don't listen to the same music, okay? So that's something that they don't always find easy. And then I say, well, now I want you to go out, okay, and write, okay, a cultural biography. You can use similar topics, family, religion, education, celebrations, okay? But I would like it, if possible, I would like it to be someone who does not have English as their L1, all right? Now, the solution is very easy. They go and look for Erasmus students, okay? There are always Erasmus students at hand, you know, in our universities. So they look for someone who speaks English, with whom they can communicate in English. They've just arrived, they don't know Spanish well enough, so they can communicate in English. And what do they do? What do I ask them to do? I ask them to interview this person between 2 and 3 times, right? And from interviewing this person, write their cultural biography, okay? They can use the same topics, and I also give them a minimum and a maximum number of words, right? And then, what do? Then I ask them to do, the third stage is a cross-cultural analysis. I ask them to compare and contrast similarities and differences between themselves and their partners, right? And I ask them, the toughest question is, what made you uncomfortable about what the other person said about, you know, how she grew up, the kind of things that she did, the kind of things that she had for, I don't know, for their meals, okay? Or what do you admire, okay, in the other person, all right? This is where the cross-cultural analysis comes in, all right? To talk about similarities and differences doesn't still force them to invest their own emotions, all right? But when I ask them about this emotional idea of what made you uncomfortable, okay, let's say they said, we used to eat snails. This was a big party, okay? And then you hear about snails or rabbit and you say, whoa, okay, all right? So the fact that they eat snails and they have a party for that, you know, that made me really uncomfortable. Or the fact that they have blood sausages, black pudding, you know, they eat blood, you know, that made me very uncomfortable, okay? Or the fact that they dress with something on their heads, you know, all right? Or the fact that when they go in front of a church, they kneel down or they do the cross, okay? So this could be something that, and then they reflect about, you know, the inner feelings about intercultural communication. Okay, so I'm finishing, all right? So that's the end of my story. I don't know. Too fast? I had it all timed. Okay, so let me share this. I wanted to finish with this sort of dilemmas. I think that we all make decisions, right? But when we teach, we have to make decisions. What am I going to do tomorrow in class? Okay, should I do this or should I do that? Okay, what will I do with third ESO? What will I do with my rowdy students in first of ESO? Okay, tomorrow. Okay, so we all make decisions. So I wanted to finish with these reflections of mine in terms of dilemmas. Okay, now the first dilemma that one has when someone deals with teacher training is, do I want my students to do what I say, or do I want my students to do what I do? Okay, if I want them to do what I say, maybe my chances of succeeding, because of what I read, the quotations that I read to you before at the beginning of my talk about the skepticism about how knowledge is transferred into actual practices, okay, maybe I'm not going to be very successful. So maybe in my classes I have to do, okay, I have to do the kind of things that I would like them to do in their classes. Of course, perhaps at a different level, but I have to try and be like I would like them to behave in their classes. Okay? So that's a first dilemma. And that's not always possible, because you could say, well, I have such a long syllabus that if I simply summarize it, then it'll be more effective. I'll give them all this knowledge, then they'll learn it by heart, they'll do a final exam, and then, you know, they'll know it and I'll be satisfied. But what will happen when they get to their classes? Okay? Will I have convinced them that this is a good methodology? Second, what is it that I would like my students to be able to do? Would I like them to be able to use English? Or would I like them to be able to operate between languages? Right? It's something very interesting. Our students in the English department, in English studies, some people say that English is a killer language. I don't agree. Okay? I don't think English is a killer language, because you know who are the students who study more languages, other languages in our Faculty of Arts? The English students. It is the English students that fill up the classrooms of French, okay, or in German, all right? Why? Because once they know English, then they go on, all right? I'm not saying that everybody is of the same view, all right? But people who like languages, they don't stop with one language, okay? Maybe it's the case with engineers, all right? Once they know English, they say, I have enough, all right? But language lovers, they don't stop, okay? So I actually think that when I teach my students, and most of them are already trilingual without knowing any other language. They come to me knowing very well Catalan, knowing very well Spanish, and knowing quite well English. Okay? And so I have to consider them as plurilingual people. I can't possibly force them to separate these languages. So I want them to be able to operate between languages. The other is, what do I teach? Do I teach English language? Or do I teach language cultures, English language cultures? All right, let me put it like this. do I teach English language cultures, right? So I have to worry about, not only about where the subject goes, but I have to worry about what kind of things do people do with the English that they speak, whatever variety of English is, right? Am I favoring multilingualism in my classes, or am I favoring plurilingualism? Now, I didn't have time to design a symbol for multilingualism, but probably here there are people who can give me better ideas. But the first thing that came to my mind was a series of boxes, separated boxes, L1 plus L2 plus L3. And so I thought that an alternative would be this kind of sphere where you have L1, L2, L3, you could put more here, all right? But notice that they are not separated, okay? They are part of a whole, but they are even connected. Okay, so you can actually establish connections from the L3 to the L2 to the L1, okay, which is actually what people say a plurilingual mind is like, all right? It's not like separate boxes, okay, you close one box and then you open the other one. No, no, they're all there, okay, and you can benefit from your knowledge in the L3, sometimes even for your L1, all right? So number 5 is, do I teach English? Or do I teach English as an international language? All right? And I think more and more I teach English as an international language, English as a lingua franca. All right? And finally, do I teach languages, or do I want to teach people to communicate in what I think is obvious to all of us, increasingly multilingual and multicultural settings? All right? Let me just finish with this metaphor, okay? Because I think this is at least the way I see teaching. You know, you are here. You are the one on the surfboard. Okay, those of you who are already teaching, but you will be here. Those of you who's not teaching. And who's the wave? Who's the wave? Your students. You ride the wave. Sometimes you drown. Okay, you drown. You know, in the water. Because your students are so big, their energy is so big that they drown you. But this is, I think, how we need to see it. Nobody, I mean, we can ride with a wave, but we can't say, what kind of wave do I want to come next? The wave comes, all right? And you surf along the wave, all right? But by surfing along the wave, your students like to take you with them, right? It's not that they don't like to take you with them. They like to take you with them. And maybe perhaps even leading them if possible. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And what a beautiful metaphor to finish. Thank you very much for sharing your ideas and your dilemmas. So let's open a space now for discussion. Well, this is what this conference is for: to discuss, to share ideas, and to communicate to each other. So let's open this space. And if you have questions, you can. I mean, this is not a very big room, so I'm sure you would need the microphone. But you just raise your hand, and we can start this discussion. Yes?
I wanted to start with thanking you for your presentation, which was very interesting, very much to the point, and I realized that I recognize a lot of dilemmas that I had when we were working on this project for 3 years, and we really were drowning, and then we at some point managed to swim to the shore that we now call plurilingualism, but then it will turn out that we're in a boat that leads to another shore perhaps. So, and also I come from a Lithuanian team, and our language is Lithuanian. It is not a big language, not as big as English or Spanish. We have different considerations, and I was thinking all the time while listening to your presentation that for Lithuanians, perhaps plurilingualism is a very sore matter. We are still thinking about such concepts as literacy and standardization of Lithuanian language, and every year we have a huge outbreak of painful discussions in press and media that our Lithuanian language literacy drops. So we do not like mixing with other languages. We are on the defensive. So plurilingualism from the position of a less powerful language perhaps is, although we now became known as one of the oldest living language, perhaps we have the potential to survive, but still we're very much afraid of losing the language in its essence if we mix with the other languages as freely as English allows itself to be modified by other languages. What would you think from this position of multilingualism?
Yeah, I can totally understand your position because my situation is very similar to yours, perhaps even worse, because at least Lithuanian has a state that supports it. But Catalan language does not have a nation state that is behind it. But I think that you know, the example that I gave you was from Spanish. But if my class has, you know, if there are a lot of Catalan students in my class, so the example they are one, I give them the example from Catalan. Okay. So in that sense, I think that I'm putting Catalan at the same level as English. I'm saying, look, to learn English, your Catalan is very useful. And I'm making Catalan a language of academia, right? So it seems to me that, you know, by putting languages together, you're not necessarily, let's say, forcing people to abandon one and keep the other. You're asking people, okay, you can still use the two of them, you know. There are different ways, different purposes of using them, but I mean, the fact that I use Catalan as a language which is worth analyzing and from which you can derive the same concepts that you can derive from English, you know, it's not a problem, right? That's the way I see it, yeah.
Thank you very much. I still think that, and because of your presentation, although today we have the finals of our project, but there arise still other things, and for instance, language loyalty perhaps, and making language a powerful player between other languages also becomes very important. So perhaps plurilingualism brings up or focuses on the statuses of the languages all around the world, and it is also yet another value of plurilingualism.
I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean. You mean by putting languages together, always be a winner and a loser?
Well, making Catalan the language of the academia through those comparative teaching attempts, and perhaps also making other smaller languages of importance in political institutions, in other discourses.
Yeah, I think that some people have been talking, especially in the in Northern Europe, Nordic countries, about the risk of domain loss. Right? There are a lot of people in Sweden and Norway, and even in Denmark and Finland, who are worried about the fact that students, university students, very soon won't be able to talk about chemistry unless they can talk in English, because they read most of the course books at university level are in English, and also many of their classes are in English, especially in very internationalized universities, where the easy option is to teach courses in English, so that we can cater for everybody, both local and non-local students. You know, so there are places like in Finland, University of Helsinki, that in some subjects, you know, there's only the English course side. Okay, but I also think that some people, there are some social linguists, you know, for instance, there's someone called Jan Blomeyer, who have said that it's not, you know, they're against other people like Philipson or Skundap Kangas, you know, who say, well, linguistic imperialism, English is going to end up with all the languages, you know. There are other people who say that there are very interesting processes going on, and that it's not so easy as saying, well, English comes in and then the other languages disappear. Because sometimes what the other languages do is to change the English. So it's not the same English that people wanted to go into the university originally. Maybe it's a kind of pidgin, all right? Or maybe it's a kind of mixture between Lithuanian and English, okay? Maybe some new varieties. So there are interesting resistance processes going on as well. But I can understand very well your situation, because when I talk about plurilingualism in Catalonia, some people say, are you sure that this is the right thing for us to do when Catalan is still a minority language, and shouldn't we just make it very monolingual? But I don't think it's the way to go ahead, you know, to respond to a monolingual ideology with another monolingual ideology. I don't think it is the way ahead. But maybe I'm very optimistic, I don't know.
In fact, we should take pity on the English language, because it's being dented, bruised, cut off, cut down, reduced.
Yes.
Yeah,
And it's spoken in Lithuanian style, in Lithuanian culture, right?
not only Lithuanian culture, and
Yeah.
style in Polish, Czech,
Yes,
and
exactly. No, but I mean,
encourage of
yeah.
students to do that.
Yeah.
Don't worry about the standard language, standard
Yeah.
English, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Just go on.
Yes.
As long as you communicate successfully, that's okay. And then I pity the English language.
Yes.
Who owns it? Yes, but you know, this is the language that you have said, the language of Shakespeare, Oscar Wilde.
But it's also the language of hundreds of millions of people who don't speak English as their first language. And what can you do with those people? There are more non-native speakers of English than native speakers, so what are you going to do there?
Yeah, but I think that we as teachers should put stress on being the language well taught, I mean with pronunciation, with accent. They don't have to be like native speakers, but at least they should have the respect for the language and try to be as much close to the, I don't know, standard English as possible.
Yeah, but what's your standard English?
Okay. I give up. I give up. Like yours.
But yeah, I think that the key concept is comprehensibility, right?
I know.
Rather than standard. You know, why do you follow the standard? Is it because the standard is the best way for people to make themselves understood? Not necessarily.
But look from the point of view of the native speakers. I mean, on the one hand, probably they are very proud. Their language is so popular and spoken widely. But on the other hand, they listen to what is being done to their language.
You know, there's a very interesting book written by someone who did an ethnography, a study, a long-term study of Erasmus students in Hungary. And one of the things that she found out is that the non-native English speakers, Erasmus students, they didn't want to be around English students because they said they don't understand us, English native speakers. They were getting along very well with the other non-native speakers, the other Erasmus students. But the English natives, they didn't understand them, and they didn't understand the natives. So they left them alone. They said, we don't want to get around with them. They don't understand us, we don't understand them. And so they form a community of non-native speakers in a way, right? So in that sense, who were the losers there? I think the native speakers. They were missing a lot, you know, because they were not making the efforts, okay? Some people are saying maybe some native speakers should be trained to speak English as an international language, right? You know, it's maybe it's a bit of a stereotype, but, you know, many people who are not language sensitive, when you tell them that you don't understand them, they speak louder, right? And then you have to tell them, I'm not deaf, I just don't understand you, okay? All right? So maybe we need to develop this sensitivity.
Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. But I just wanted to... Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. I just wanted to say that, you know, David Crystal, the linguist, he talks about how native speakers today are adapting, in fact, to non-native speakers English. You know, like, for example, even the word research, which is uncountable, but there are people who now use it as researchers. and this is being accepted. So I think what we need to do is just to have this kind of, as we talk of accommodating, and also bringing like localization. It's like we adapt the local context to the international context, and this, in fact, will bring some kind of general understanding about between ourselves. So I think this is the idea today, isn't it? That communication is the most important thing in a language. So that's it. So we just try to communicate in whatever way we can, even if we have to use sign language or whatever. But I think that's great, that we should all reach an understanding, and we should call it global English or world Englishes, as it has been called also by Kanagaraja, yes, before. So that's it. So we don't need to refer to standard English or, the RP as it used to be, but just to say it's global English, and we're all here, and we can all understand each other. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like just to support the idea that no one owns English, and I fully agree with this, but I'd like just to give you an example of TESOL conventions, which, and certainly they are, you know that they take place in the States, and TESOL means Teachers of English to Speakers of Other Languages. For many years, only native English speakers were forming a very great force, but like 15 or 20 years ago, there is a special caucus which is called non-native English-speaking teachers, and it is proved that, in fact, there are more non-native English-speaking teachers in the world, and we are the great force. So, what I'd like just want to say, we have to be proud of ourselves that we really shuttle between different languages, and it only proves that English belongs to no one, it belongs to all of us. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation.
I was going to say, I totally agree with you. But I don't know what it is like now, but the Cambridge exams, the Cambridge examination syndicate exams, some years ago they didn't accept non-native speakers as examiners. I don't know if they still do that. So these are the kind of things that we should, if they still go on, all right, that we should really fight against, this idea of how do you know that I'm not a competent examiner just because my name is Cots or my name is whatever, all right, because I wasn't born, okay? The idea of native speakership is very complex in itself, What is a native speaker? Someone who was born, someone who grew up. I mean, there's all kinds of, complexities in the concept itself. I think sometimes we trivialize this. But, so it's changed. Elena, you're saying that it's changed now, that non-native speakers can be examiners in the Cambridge examination?
Yeah, they need to have C1 level.
All right.
Sorry, C2 level.
C2
and
level.
they can examine up to B2.
Okay.
Yes, they cannot.
Not beyond.
Not beyond.
Not beyond. Even if you have a C2 level, you cannot examine other C2 levels.
I also understand that you allow non-native examiners to examine to the top or the level, so they not working.
Well, thank you very much for your interesting and revealing exposition. I totally agree what you said, your statement referred that we have to teach international English. But my question is, what do you mean by international English? Is it the product of all the interlanguages that we produce when we learn a second language and a third language? Or what do you mean exactly by international language?
International English as an international language, in principle, would be defined as the English used between interlocutors who don't have English as their L1. This was the first definition, right? So if I were speaking English with a German, then we would be using English as an international language, all right? But nowadays things are changing, and they're even saying that even communication between a native speaker of English and a non-native speaker of English, that could also be defined as an English as an international language. Okay? There have been people like Jennifer Jenkins who have even attempted to describe some of the features of English as an international language, okay? But I think that that has been seriously criticized because they say that this would be putting English as English as an international language as another fixed variety. So, for instance, third S, the S in the third person inflection. So, Jennifer Jenkins started saying, well, maybe we should say that English is an international language. Instead of saying he speaks, then we say he speak, all right? But some people have said, well, this would be sort of putting them, you know, it's the same idea about the caucus, the special caucus in TESOL. Why do we need to have a special group for non-native speakers? You know, why don't we all mix, all right? As long as we are comprehensible, we are understandable, we are fluent people, you know, what does it matter? Okay. Anyway, so the idea is basically English as it is used by people who do not share the same language, all right? And that would be English. And independently of whether they are native speakers or non-native speakers, right, as a means of communication. Whether that is promoting linguistic imperialism, that's something else, all right? Because if we're saying, well, if every time you don't share the language with the other, that's not necessarily the case. Because, for instance, I think that some people are talking about linguas francas, okay? But it seems that there's more and more the idea that we are developing regional lingua francas, all right? So Brazilians and Argentinians, what do you think they use to communicate? Brazilians and Argentinians, do you think they use English? Probably Spanish. Or what about Spanish and Portuguese? What do they use? Spanish. So does this tell us that Spanish is becoming a regional lingua franca in Latin America, for example, or in the Iberian Peninsula, all right? Well, what do Spanish and Basque native speakers use to communicate? Spanish, right? Okay. So maybe we're talking about regional lingua francas, all right, rather than one single lingua franca. I don't know, but that's the idea.
I've been a house teacher and right now a job shadower, but my background in the American studies, I'm thinking about hyphenated identity of language as in America. So it's like, for example, I'm from Poland, so it's like Polish Americans, they're Polish Americans, I'm sure Spanish Americans. What do you think about the idea of adding the background to the, well, you know, hyphenated identity like English, so that would be like Polish English, which sometimes is referred to as Ponglish, Pidgin English, but with the elements of Polish. I've spoken to people from Singapore and also from Canada, and they have adopted their original languages. In Singapore, there are 4 languages, official languages, and they adopted them. You know, they used a mixture of Singaporean and English, but they use a special word for it. So what do you think about this idea for the future of linguistic future of, let's say, Europe?
No, I think that cases like Singapore are excellent cases of plurilingualism. You know, plurilingualism is never a system of complete systems. It's always a fragmented system of fragmented languages. I mean, plurilingual people are not as good in all of their 4 languages, you know. They're good at saying something. Sometimes, I mean, the most multilingual people, they can go to the bakers and use one language, and to talk to their kids, you know, they're better off when they use another language, but when they go to their kids' school, then they have to use the language of the teachers. So, but they're never very good at every single language, okay? So I think it's great, the idea of having hybridity around is very good. But I was going to say, you're not only Polish, are you Polish American? But you're also a woman, all right? You're also a teacher, and that makes your culture even more messy, okay? And that's fascinating, you know, because that takes us away from this idea, this essentialist idea of one language, one culture. You were born under the umbrella of a state, then you have to, that's not good, you know. I like messy people, all right? Because they are good examples, all right? And this is important for the students that we teach, you know, 10, 12-year-olds. You know, we have to tell them that the world is messy, okay? But that's fun.
Any other question? Let me have one question.
I also wanted to share some experience last year that I was in Brussels, and it happens the same you told that English native speakers were apart from the rest of the group because they didn't have the effort to be understood, and also we couldn't understood them. So we make groups, but sometimes we conflude in the same group. And also I wanted to ask you if you had any time a student that doesn't know anything about English or Catalan, how could you teach this method with this student that has no idea of anything that from the beginning?
Yeah, okay, that's a tough thing. I don't know. That's why there are primary school teachers, excellent teacher trainers,
So you say that this method is just if you have if they have some background about all the languages.
You need to have, but I would say that everybody has some background, right? Even if you deal with 5-year-old schoolers, they know a language, right? Because they speak it with their parents, so you can start from that. What I'm saying is that don't ignore the linguistic knowledge with which they come to you, right? But you're right about, I've been in the situation, not knowing English, but then you may be wondering, what do you do with Erasmus students who don't know either Spanish or Catalan, like students from Korea, right? If they don't know Spanish or Catalan, and I start from the student L1, I can't start from Korean because I have no idea, all right? So that's why I translate into English the L1 examples. That gives me a bit more work, but then they can follow. But I realized that this is, that I should include Korean, but unfortunately,
Because for us, for Spanish speakers, we could learn easy French or Catalan, some languages that we have surrounding us, but not, for example, Chinese or
you're right.
that is completely different.
But I wouldn't exclude the possibility that the same idea of starting with what you know in your L1 and following up and moving into the foreign language that you're learning is not possible in Chinese, independently of how complex. But if you're working with L1 Chinese students, then I would say it should be possible. But of course, that's a lot. I don't know.
Just to suggest them to talk to the class and try if the class understands something.
What do you mean?
No, if there is some Chinese in the class,
yes.
and you suggest him to speak to the class and just
yes. That would be a possibility. Hopeless with my students. Thank you.
Okay, just one question, if there is any. Yes, we are now on the schedule for the program, so we catch up this time. So thank you very much, and all of you, for this discussion. And now we have the coffee break at the cafeteria here at the faculty. You are all invited to go and have a coffee because we need energy to continue with the program. So thank you very much, and we'll come back